Guys, it's Khalil,
Hey, it's Chad.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. All right, so 3 days ago, we just finished our series on truth, the three-parter, and we told you guys that we were going to start a series of special episodes for the next couple weeks until the foreseeable future when we can come back to another series that we have planned um, on how liberalism has the potential of leading to fascism if all things go wrong. Um, and we said that the first of these special episodes was going to be on whether or not the atomic bombs on Japan were justified. So, um, as you can imagine, this is going to be a very fact-driven sort of video. We want to make it as entertaining as possible, so we have a lot of climactic parts. We want to give like the other side of the argument, but we really just want to inform rather than converse like how we have over the past few episodes, to really hammer home the point, the position that we have that we think is the correct one, that the atomic bombs on Japan saved lives and were therefore justified. Like, if you were to ask me the question of if the atomic bombs on Japan were justified in 1945, I'd say yes, and
Yep.
that'd be it. That'd be it. That'd be it. But we want to go a little further with our explanation. So, um, um, what we want to introduce is a background on what we're talking about. Now, a lot of people don't know a lot of the context of the bombs being dropped at that time in August of 1945. Some people don't even know that there was more than one. So, just a little context. It's August 1945, 3 months since Germany surrendered. U.S. has fought the two worst battles in the Pacific at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The US has developed recently the nuclear bomb tested on July 16th. The USSR is planning an invasion of Manchuria of northern China, and plans had already been developed for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan.
Yeah. So as we mentioned, one of the things that had happened before the dropping of the atomic bombs was the conclusion of the main fighting area of the Pacific Theater. And one of the biggest battles of that time was the Battle of Okinawa. So this battle occurred from the 1st of April to June 22nd, just about 3 months long. And during those 3 months, it was one of, if not the bloodiest battle in the entirety of the Pacific Theater. Combined, there's about 160,000 casualties, with about 50,000 on the Allied side and 117,000 on the Japanese side. It was very, very brutal. In this battle, civilians were drafted up on the Japanese side to fight against American soldiers. Surrender was basically not even an option on the Japanese side. American soldiers would have to fight against troops dug into trenches who would rather blow themselves up than give themselves up. And over these 3 months, forces like the Marines and the Navy suffered very, very, very heavy casualties. And so this battle, while at the end of the Pacific Theater, would come to be a very deciding factor in the post-war plan of what the United States was to do with Japan um, going forward.
Yeah, so with other big events on the Pacific Theater, which is what is commonly called the war against Japan, the Pacific Theater, in the Battle of Okinawa, the Battle of Iwo Jima in February of 1945, the Philippines campaign throughout 44 and 45, and the very consequential Battle of Guadalcanal earlier in the war in 42, 43. Even as early as then, there was given an idea of how hard the Japanese soldiers would fight. Because for the first few months of the Pacific Theater, the Japanese were on the offense. They were invading China as they had been for 4 years up until that point, since their invasion in 1937. Um, and under threat of their oil supplies being cut off from the Americans, they attacked Pearl Harbor, which started the Pacific Theater with America. Um, and 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 attacked all across the Pacific front, taking colonies from Britain, the Netherlands, from France, and were even attacking parts of Australia. So they had a huge blitzkrieg in the first few months of the Pacific theater. But as soon as the Americans and the other allies were pushing them back, Japanese soldiers would start strapping bombs to young boys to tell them to run under American tanks. They convinced entire local populations that the Americans would eat them, and they should kill themselves to avoid that fate. Um, they would strap bombs to babies or give or or put bombs around blankets to disguise them as babies, to teenage girls, faking to surrender, and then blowing up entire American columns. And of course, the very famous kamikaze strikes. Um, so Additionally, there were civilian reprisals for any civilians that didn't want to fight, for so-called aiding the Americans. Um, and they did these reprisals for dissuading the Americans from advancing. They refused to surrender, which was a very butchered version of the Samurai Bushido Code, which which maintained self-respect, defense of family and motherland. And they also had a reputation to uphold, in preparation for the invasion of Japan, but then also through each battle throughout the Pacific theater. Japan had never been successfully invaded in a time of war by a hostile force. So basically, the more we fought, the worse it got.
Yeah. The Pacific Theater was one of the most brutal theaters of war that had been fought up to the time. So both the American side and the entire world was looking for ways to kind of end this fighting, of course. And so one of the ways that the United States had begun this process and had been going through the whole war was the Manhattan Project. So the Manhattan Project was the United States effort to build the world's first atomic bomb. And this research began in 1942 and lasted for about 3 years. And this was honestly, it was one of the quickest development times for such a huge project. Millions, if not billions, of dollars were pumped into this project, and over the 3 years, um, an atomic bomb was developed. And so, on July 16th, 1945, the world's first atomic bomb was tested in White Sands, New Mexico, I believe, during the night, no, early morning. And what was detonated was a device called the gadget, which I always find really funny, and which had a yield of 24 kilotons. So that is about 24,000 tons of TNT, like an explosion that had an equivalent of that amount, was tested, and it was obviously the largest bomb that had ever been detonated in the entire world's history. It was an incredible event. This is where we get the quote from Oppenheimer saying that I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, because it was the very first time anything like this had ever been done, and foreshadowed, of course, what was to come. And just a little side note, so the atomic bombs that we're talking about here are fission-based atomic weapons. These are different than the ones that are fielded now, which are thermonuclear, which are basically two stages where they use a fission bomb to ignite a fusion explosion. And so at the time of World War II, all we had was fission-based atomic weapons. So the atomic bombs that we dropped on Japan, both Little Boy and Fat Man, they were fission-based nuclear weapons. And so they had lower, we say lower as if they were not huge weapons. They had lower yields than the ones that we field now, but these were developed over the course of 3 years, and as we saw, were dropped on Japan on August 6th and August 9th.
Yeah, and the lead up to those bombs being dropped was actually the Potsdam Declaration, a declaration made by the Allied powers, chiefly by Truman, the leader of the United States at the time, the president at the time, to dissuade the Japanese away from continued resistance. And here is almost a full quote of the entire declaration. We both shortened this declaration down to the shortest that we could, but I'm just going to read off the like a section of it that I find most important. We do not intend that the Japanese shall be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation, but stern justice shall be meted out to all war criminals, including those who have visited cruelties upon our prisoners. The Japanese government shall remove all obstacles to the revival and strengthening of democratic tendencies among the Japanese people. Freedom of speech, of religion, and of thought, as well as respect for the fundamental human rights shall be established. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. So, the war crimes that Truman was referring to in that declaration was a series of crimes against humanity, essentially, truly crimes against humanity that the Japanese forces were conducting throughout the Pacific Theater, beginning really as early as their initial invasion of northern China, Manchuria, in 1931, and throughout their invasion of China starting in 1937 up until the day they surrendered, which included, but not limited to, torturings, killings of civilian population, of the and of Allied POWs, prisoners of war, who surrendered when it seemed that their fight was over. That same fate met with them: torturings and killings, medical experiments, and there were even examples of Allied POWs being brought over to Japanese universities in the last couple of years of the war, and live medical experimentations and tests on anatomy would be done on those POWs, really just a sign of their barbarity. An additional statistic that I was going to wait until the end of this episode, but I think it's good for you to know early on now, is that the Pacific Theater killed 25 million people, mostly inflicted by Japanese soldiers. And we all hear about the rape of Nanking, as a really big example, but it was not just that. It was not a simple burst of militarism, of barbarity by the Japanese forces. It was a continued thing that was being enacted all throughout those 8 years of conflict, from the invasion of China to the second bomb being dropped. 90% of all casualties of those 25 million that were dead by the end of the conflict were civilians, non-combatants. So Japan was not the good guys here. And and the military government that led Japan at the time was bolder than even the Nazis, in the sense that they didn't care what neutral nations thought. The thing about the Nazis near the last few months of the war, and really throughout their war in Europe, was that they wanted to draw in neutral nations like Spain, Turkey, Sweden, Switzerland, even, and just kind of use propaganda over to them to say that the Allies were even worse than them, in that a fight for civilization needed to be begun to wipe them off the face of the earth, this evil. And so Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Nazi Germany at the time, manipulated the effect of the Dresden firebombing, which we don't really have time to explain, but it was a one bombing run on one night in February of 1945 in an East German city called Dresden that killed 25,000 people. Goebbels lied and it said it was 250,000. and that was done in an attempt to gain favor from neutral nations. Japan did not care about such things. By their time that they began fighting um, the colonial powers in East Asia, like Britain, France, including America and the Dutch, um, they basically said that any troop on the Japanese home islands would lead to the killing of all POWs, which was in the hundreds of thousands by that point, um, and would lead to essentially a national suicide, a suicide as was called of the 100 million of the Japanese people. To punish those in power, essentially, that we can take from this is that sometimes your only option is to punish the people. Other examples are Russia now, with the sanctions being brought on it. You need to hurt the people sometimes to hurt Putin. Um, After hearing about the camps in Western China and Xinjiang against the Uyghurs, tariffs were brought against China that have not been released until today, and threats of sanctions are being brought to Japan for them possibly aiding Russia or the threat of doing so in the future, and Iran since the communist theocratic revolution in 1979. So, yeah.
Yeah. One of the takeaways, as we said, is that sometimes the only option that you do have is to punish the people. And of course, that's what ended up happening in the situation of the atomic bombings. The weapons that were used targeted civilians. They targeted two cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the days of August 6th and August 9th of 1945. They used two nuclear weapons of 15 kilotons and 21 kilotons and caused the casualties of about 230,000 between the two. And of course, that's neglecting the ongoing impacts that radiation poisoning and environmental damage that in some parts is still being felt through the generations today. Um, so as we go through and give context to where this kind of argument is, one of the biggest ideas that we'd like to bring up is the this idea of the plan of Operation Downfall. So what we have in Operation Downfall was the United States plan to invade mainland Japan, should this was in the case that the atomic bombs were not to have been dropped on Japan, and this was basically seen as the only option. So in Operation Downfall, the first day of the operation was to begin on November 1st, 1945, in what was called X Day. And so in this operation, it would begin with the invasion of Kyushu, which we could see down there is one of the smaller of the main islands of Japan. And so this would involve an amphibious landing bigger than any that the world has ever seen. It would have been the largest amphibious landing ever. Make D-Day look like child's play. So overall, projections estimated that it would have seen the involvement of more than 5 million American troops over the course of the operation that was seen to be about 2 or so years. And along with this, it would have involved more than 1 million troops from the United Kingdom, and of course, uh, thousands, if not millions, of other troops from our other regional allies like Burma or Australia or anything like that.
Or
So,
China
all,
and the Soviet Union. Yeah.
oh, my apologies. Yeah. So all of this would have been in opposition to, as we see, we're invading mainland Japan. And so the population of Japan was about the population of Japan now is about 100 million. And during the time of the invasion, the kind of opposition that the United States was looking at was one that we had not encountered or ever seen really before. So on mainland Japan, there were more than 4 million soldiers ready and willing to defend the mainland against the United States and British and Allied troops. And this, and add on top of this, that there are about 31.5 million civilians that would have been, age or otherwise, available to have been conscripted and to fight against the Allied and American soldiers who would be landing in Japan. And so the citizens of Japan, I mean, Japan had a conscriptory army, and should this invasion have begun, they would have been brought to the front lines, used as saboteurs, used as suicide bombers, used as any sort of fighting force that they could be, any sort of fighting force that they could be mustered against the invaded forces. Um, all children that were able to run were given bamboo sticks and ready to fight. The people before the invasion had been being trained to fight against the invading forces. And so by the time the invasion would have happened, this would have been, I mean, to call it bloody is an understatement. Um, before, I mean, in this operation, the Japanese, they knew where the United States would be invading. They knew that we would be starting at the island of Kyushu, as you can see here. And so, very, very kind of in-depth defense forces were kind of planned for for the island of Kyushu in the operation called, I believe, Tengo. And this had been kind of, they had been drawing up this plan for more than a year. And so coastal artillery, minefields, trenches, tunnels, bunkers, anything was kind of built around this island. And so the Japanese would be ready and waiting and knowing when, well, not exactly when, but where American forces would be invading. Let's see. And so I can ask you, Khalil, to kind of talk about and some of the obstacles and things that would have been involved in this invasion.
Right. As we prepared this presentation of these like visual aids for a few of you guys here that don't know the geography of Japan, we wanted to give you an idea of just how mountainous the whole country was. Um, like the additional civilian and military resistance, we already touched on and will definitely continue to expand upon, but we cannot forget the natural facts about any such invasion of Japan, because as time has gone on in human history, we tend to think that humankind has surpassed nature, but really nature is what rules over us even to this day. And it certainly was the case in 1945. As we can see with the southern island of Kyushu here, um, like it is very mountainous. And again, right here, we can see that the peaks are close to 2,000 feet. Is this feet or meters?
Doesn't say.
I mean,
I believe
shit,
it'd be meters.
shit. We can check. Okay, what was is this Mountain Hiroshima? Yeah, we can check this one. And
Yeah.
um the peak height is actually right, that is in meters. So right here, this is around 6,000 feet, same around 6,000 for each one of these other peaks here. So these are no small mounds in the ground here. These are huge mountain peaks that that any American invading force would have to go around. And even if they did consider going around these mountain peaks, such like defending Japanese forces would hole up in these mountain faces here, because anyone who's watching in on the news in Ukraine will hear about very stubborn Ukrainian resistance. But the fact is, Ukraine is almost the opposite of Japan in the sense that um, it's very much the same in terms of its resistance, probably even more fanatical than Ukraine, but the geography is so much more like headed for the defenders. In Ukraine, it's very flat, very few mountains. There are like forests that soldiers can hide in, defending soldiers can hide in, but over here in mountains, um, soldiers could hold out for weeks or months. So even the invasion of Kyushu itself was a very dangerous thing, which is why they didn't just plan on invading Kyushu. Um, the invasion also included, for of course, a strike on the capital, Tokyo, which which was meant to force the government into some sort of negotiation, but then also to subjugate the island in its entirety. Since Japan isn't just one separate island, it's a series of islands. They would have to then take Shikoku and the main island of Honshu, which has huge geographical limits here.
Hmm.
If anyone was considering to advance from Kyushu to the Kyushu right here onto the Shikogu mountain range right here, that would lead us straight over to the Japanese Alps, which is on the other side of the capital city. So I hope you can see from all that that the such invasion of Japan would be very hard. And also, we need to consider the fact that in such an invasion, again, looking at the geographical aspects, since Japan is a series of islands, who's to say that the government, like the emperor and the imperial family and all the cabinet and military officials, wouldn't move to the northernmost island, which is Hokkaido, north of the main island of Honshu. Um, like even if Allied troops were just pushing their way onto Tokyo here, it may not matter all too much because of all the people who are doing the decision making in war are in Hokkaido. So we wanted to make sure you guys knew about the geographic limits that the Americans and other allies would be facing in the case of such an invasion.
Yeah. And so, even geographically, there are incredible obstacles that need to be faced for such an invasion to even just happen. And to go well, it almost looks impossible. And so, in the Operation Downfall, when the U.S. Army and when the U.S. military were planning it, the casualty outlooks were extremely, extremely high. And so one of the sources that I like to cite, and so in January of 1945, January, so this is before the battles of Okinawa and before the Battle of Iwo Jima, which, as we mentioned before, were some of the most brutal in the entire Pacific theater. So in January of 1945, the U.S. Army Service Forces put out a report looking at the casualty estimates of this Operation Downfall. So looking at the first 18 months, so about a year and a half of the operation, the U.S. Army, so not including the Navy or the Marines or the Army Air Forces, or the Air Force. It was only the Army Air Force at the time. So only the United States Army at this first 18 months projected that there would be 863,000 dead within those first 18 months. And then add upon that 267,000 soldiers missing in action or wounded in action. 863,000 dead within the first 18 months. And this was, even, as we said, this was before we'd seen the most ferocious battles of the Pacific. And for comparison, you would need to look up some of the battles even of like World War One. Take the Battle of Verdun, which was fought in 1916 between France and Germany. In that battle, combined, there were about 1 million casualties. And so in this operation, the U.S. Army alone, not just the entire invasion force, just the U.S. Army, projected that there could be 863,000 soldiers dead in just a year and a half. And so looking at this invasion, it would have been a bloodbath.
But
Um,
then,
yeah. Would you have more to add?
yeah, I'm just referring back to the Battle of Okinawa. That We looked at the casualty figures for that battle, for that 3 month long battle, and we also have to remind ourselves that the Japanese forces that were stationed there, um, Imperial forces probably numbered, as I see here, about 115,000. You know, like they say 77,000 strong garrison with 9,000 Imperial Japanese Navy troops trained in ground combat and 39,000 drafted local Ryukyuan people, like the local population. If we count that in all of the defending forces, including 24,000 hastily drafted militia troops and 15,000 non-uniformed laborers, um, then that comes to a number around 130,000, I believe. And we see that the casualty counts for the Japanese were around 118, 115,000, I think it was.
Yeah,
So that's a casualty rate of around 90, 95%, something like 90%. So
it's
like
incredible. Almost, I mean, you
just
would
like
you
yeah.
would look at the individual battle themselves. So units that would go fight in the Battle of Okinawa, these Japanese units would fight to their then they're absolutely eliminated. Like no one left, no sergeants, no medics left, done until the entire units were annihilated. Because what we saw in that battle was the whole idea of no surrender. So you either die in battle or you would kill yourself. You would not give yourself over to the enemy. We did see in the Battle of Okinawa there were about, I believe, 7,000 people who were captured, but just compare that to, you would just have to ask how many thousands, if not tens of thousands, of soldiers rather died in battle in situations where a normal fighting force would have just surrendered or given up. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of those soldiers and civilians as well, who killed themselves or were killed as opposed to giving up. And so
And
if you thought that was bad, just imagine an invasion of the homeland of Japan. These are people's houses that they're now fighting for. This is where families have given up. So not just the soldiers fighting hard, but the civilians, the people who have lived there for their entire lives, fighting for their homeland. It's going to be a battle like the world has never ever seen. And so
and
you would look at these casualty rates of Okinawa, compare that to what might happen in the Battle of Japan, and nothing.
right, like the it's this is kind of the fact of the Pacific Theater. You know, it's like you're not talking about continuous continental land masses that you can retreat to. You know,
Hmm.
like on the European front, against Hitler and Mussolini, and other Axis forces, there was always somewhere that they could retreat to. There was very little of an example um, in World War II in Europe, um, of a force being boxed out of land. You know, there was an example of like the German retreat from North Africa, the Battle of Dunkirk, but very few examples are like that. But in the Pacific Theater, that was just that was just how it was. Okinawa is an island. It's a very small island, and there was an understanding that since Japan had basically lost its navy, you know, like all the additional like navy say like vessels were submarine like vessels that would pick off like any Japanese any American boats that they could find, but there weren't that many of them and fuel was running out. There wasn't much of a navy to evacuate forces from Okinawa, for example. And so there was two options, die or surrender, and people chose to die. Out of the 130,000 troops, including civilian population, including like civilian fighting, like militia, and like hastily in service militia
Draft.
actually drafted. That included 15-year-old like native Ryukyuan boys that wanted to defend their families for some cases. They would rather die than surrender, and that's what we saw. Like literally, like you do the math. If there's 125, 130,000 that are fighting on the Japanese side, 118,000 die, 7,000 surrender. Who's left? Who's left?
kind of
And
lie.
even on the American, yeah, on the American side, like there were 180,000 American soldiers that went into Okinawa. 72,000 of them, was it 50,000
It's
that
50, around 50,000.
50,000 that died, was it? Not
So
just
the
like
casualty, it was about 50,000 casualties. So that includes dead, wounded, and missing in action. And if I remember correctly, it was about 12,000 were KIA, were killed in the Battle of Okinawa.
right. So even with a significant advantage in men as they invaded the island of only 80,000 Japanese like imperial regular troops, along with 50,000 of like local people engaged into the fight, um, there was still very high casualties on the American side. About a quarter of all of them being wounded, missing, or killed. Now, there needs to be also a recognition of how hard an amphibious landing is, which is why in the document here that we have like notes of so we can help ourselves explain to you why the bombs were justified. We say that um, we look at general trends throughout history, especially in the past 100 years, of of key factors for victory in amphibious landings. One is air superiority. Two is surprise or a manpower advantage. And three is rapid reinforcement. In the case of such an invasion of Japan, air superiority would not be too difficult because other than the kamikaze planes that were hitting the Navy, there wasn't much planes to
Yeah,
oppose the
the
American
Japanese Air
bombers.
Force was very much wiped out. I mean, this is why such bombing raids like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the bombing of Tokyo, and other sort of bombings all across Japan would sometimes just go completely uncontested. That there was no Air Force that was really even able to respond to that. All they really had was anti-aircraft guns. So when it came to an invasion like this, there's really not much on the air superiority side that Japan can do. And also add in naval support. There wasn't really much of a navy at all that had been decimated over the 5 years of fighting. And then add in the shortages that Japan had in oil, basically fuel. You need fuel to move those ships. There was no oil. So there's no ships really to really back up any sort of fight.
Right.
With these, actually, you could go on.
And then with the additional two other factors for victory and an amphibious landing. Oh, and Chad, you can comment on this when I'm done about these three factors here, because the more that we can say about it, the better. 'Cause so people here can understand. Surprise, the manpower advantage. It was becoming clear that even though millions of troops were being readied for this invasion, as Chad said, there were 4 million Japanese troops, regular troops that were trained, had years of experience, that were ready to defend their homeland. And that's not even including the 30 or so million Japanese civilians that had also been trained in the months leading up to this potential invasion near the end of the war um, um, to um, to engage in that fight as well.
Mm,
So the manpower advantage, that was becoming a very big ask. So then there was the idea of surprise, which is included in the second factor. They didn't have much of this surprise. Although the Japanese weren't expecting a strike on Honshu, which is the main Japanese island as part of this first assault, or so early on in this potential invasion, they were 100% expecting the Allies to come into Kyushu, especially southern Kyushu, since Okinawa was south of the home islands. Um, so there was almost no surprise. It was just a matter of when they would come.
yeah.
And then the
Um,
rapid, yeah,
just to add a little about that, surprise is necessary for an amphibious operation. if an enemy knows exactly where you're going to land, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to place mines, they're going to place guns, artillery. They're going to have everyone ready there waiting for you. So when you send out your landing boats, they're just going to get shot out of the water. D-Day worked. One of the reasons that D-Day worked was that the Allies um, managed to deceive Germany as to where the Allies would land. Germany had an idea that the Allies were going to launch an amphibious invasion. At the time of the war, it was just a matter of time of just where. And so before D-Day, a fake landing operation was it was set out in Western Germany. I can't remember exactly where. Um, but along with that, paratroopers were dropped into the country, not in Germany, in France, my bad. Um, Paratroopers were also dropped into the country, and other sort of deceiving operations were had. And so when the actual landing happened, it was kind of a guess of where it would be, and it's just a matter of time until the people at the front lines would radio that there's a bunch of boats coming at them.
And
If
then reinforcements
if
would
the
be
enemy
brought in.
knows, yeah, if the enemy knows, you're dead. And
Right.
so and here the Japanese knew exactly where they were going to land. It's just wondering what day on the calendar they were going to pick. And usually that's just dependent on weather. So if the Japanese can guess what day, what month, what week, what hour the Americans were going to invade, it's needless to say it would have been a bloodbath.
Right. And D-Day is a very popular example of an amphibious landing, but this was also the case in World War II, with, I believe, Operation Mincemeat, the invasion of Sicily, which people don't know too much about. As the Nazis and the Italians were being pushed out of North Africa, there was a question for Hitler and Mussolini, leaders of Germany, of course, and Italy at the time, of where the Allies would strike next. Churchill and other Allied leaders tried to convince the Axis that they would invade Greece first, because yeah, I mean, like they tried to convince the Axis that they would invade Greece first, and so they would be convincing the Axis, like Hitler and Mussolini, to divert their defense troops to Greece to defend against a possible assault. Um, but they were actually going to strike Sicily, and up until the last day, there was a worry amongst the Allied high command that Hitler and Mussolini, they wouldn't buy it. Now, eventually it worked, but it was a very scary operation. Surprise is key. If they know where you're going to attack, they don't even need a manpower advantage. They could be outnumbered 3-1 and still give up a really good fight. Ever
Hmm.
heard of Omaha Beach? Yeah.
Yep.
So,
I mean, if you thought D-Day was a hard operation, just wait to invade Kyushu. So
right. In Japan,
another
it's
one of
one island, it's multiple islands. They'd have to be doing that multiple times over. The
yeah,
Shikoku, Honshu, and Hokkaido.
oh yeah. So another important factor when it comes to these amphibious operations is rapid reinforcements. And so when you came to this kind of operation, not only is it far from some of the U.S. footholds that we had in the area, one of the biggest ones, of course, was Okinawa, which was used for the bombing raids and other sort of operations. But just given the amount of casualties that were expected in the first kind of weeks of the battle of the operation, the the necessity of reinforcements for this kind of operation was very, 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 very important. So, in another report, the U.S. Sixth Army, so it's an army group that encompasses a bunch of divisions and things of that sort that would be taking part in the operation to take Kyushu. So this was in Operation Olympic, which is basically the first part of Operation Downfall. They would be invading the small island, the first island of Kyushu. So in this first phase of the invasion, the U.S. Sixth Army anticipated that they would have 395,000 casualties. In this case, these casualties, they counted them as not just deaths, but injuries seriously enough to remove these soldiers from the unit roll call list. So basically, injuries that they could not come back to the battlefield from. They expected 395,000 of these casualties within the 3 months. And this number was so close to outstripping the amount of reinforcements that they had, that it would eventually, as the number was bumped up, as projections got worse, it counted into the reasons why it was later doubted. Doubts were had about the effectiveness of this operation. And so this just underscores how important reinforcements are in an amphibious operation, because not only once you land your troops, they're going to need supplies, they're going to need ammo, they're going to need fresh troops, they're going to need medics, because especially in something like this, there's going to be so many deaths and so many things that the frontline soldiers are going to need. And so you're going to have to be refreshing them so much more quicker than in operations like D-Day, and other operations like Operation Mincemeat. You need new supplies. You need to keep these troops able to keep fighting so that the defensive forces can't just swarm in and push them off the beach. Because if you get pushed off the beach or just get pushed back to it, what are you supposed to do? Send the landing troops back and just bring them back to their boats? You have to hold a beachhead, and with that, you need reinforcements constantly. And so, if you're taking so many casualties to the point where the reinforcements that you're getting are just getting turned over, like barely even just replacing the ones who had just died, say, an hour earlier, it's almost ineffective.
Right. And in the preparation for such an operation, the Americans called it Operation Downfall. And the Japanese, they considered such a defensive operation as being Ketsu Go. The Americans, um, they manufactured 1 million Purple Hearts minted for this mission alone. They very rightly assumed that not that with such casualties and with such possible deaths that be coming from this invasion, which was expected to take at least 2 years in the conventional conflict and up to 10 years of guerrilla fighting to finally complete. Um, that they would, of course, lead to a lot of heroic acts, and therefore medals were being printed and minted, like by the hundreds of thousands, and 1 million of them eventually were made before this mission. So heading to the main um, arguments of this academic debate, a lot of people find themselves in. It like the bombs weren't justified because the consequences of the nuke um were were very bad. And Chad, you can expand on this. The
Oh, for sure.
Soviet invasions of northern China, which we'll get a lot more into, um, were also a big reason for the Japanese to surrender. So some say that it wasn't the bombs that made the Japan surrender, and or that they would say that they would have surrendered anyway. That they looked at their geographic situation and see the battle lines move up closer towards the home islands. Look at the advantage that the Americans had. Look at their technological advantage. Look at the firebombing campaign that was happening at the time. You know, hundreds of thousands of civilians and people on the island dying. That Japan would have surrendered anyway. That they would have folded to that pressure. Um, yeah, and then of course, Chad, you can go into explain the stronger argument of why the nukes were justified.
Yeah. So as we said, this is an argument that exists today, 70 or so years after this happened. And so on the side that still exists, and the side that we are essentially supporting, is that the nukes were justified because the Japanese government would not have just randomly surrendered, just given time. While there were internal divisions, the military, people who say that the military within the Japanese government would not have accepted any sort of surrender if there was not any huge show of force that would, surprise them or anything. In that, which leads us to the second reason is that the bombs were justified because it stopped the Operation Downfall, which we just described, in the invasion of Japan. The invasion of Japan, as we just explained, was to be very, very costly, way much more costly than the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So combined, those two were about 230,000 casualties and long-term effects. The invasion of Japan, as we said, we said that the United States would have suffered close to 1 million casualties. That's not even including the amount of Japanese casualties in both the army and the civilians. So on that side of the argument, they're saying that the use of the atomic bomb further led to the surrender of the Japanese government, which led to Operation Downfall not being implemented. And so the use of these bombs was justified because in the long run, it saved a lot more lives than the lives that ultimately were taken by the atomic bomb.
Right. And as we mentioned in our last episode, a lot of the big decisions by these people in power, these government officials, these heads of state, is often looking at what to do and what not to do. And that's always based off of how many lives are going to be saved. Now, nations often have like other reasons for doing things, but you can look pretty consistently, especially in the atomic age, of how many lives are going to be saved. Is it worth the action? So this ties a lot more to the last episode that we posted about neutrality, in the sense that did the bombs save lives? Of course.
hmm As we said,
And
if we'd gone through with this invasion, millions of people would have died in an operation that, as we saw, just did not really even need to happen. It was unnecessary. These bombs, once they dropped, it gave the Japanese government such a surprise. It convinced so many in the government who were kind of looking for a way out of it. It gave them a reason to get out of it. It stopped this tragedy, basically, of an invasion, of a battle from occurring. And while, as we saw, hundreds of thousands of people were lost, millions would have been lost through this invasion. And so the use of these bombs, it seems contradictory to say that bombs save lives, but in this case, it somewhat did.
right. So there are a couple things that we wanted to say in this video. Actually, quite a lot of things that we wanted to say in this video. We thought we could wrap it up in one episode, but no, we're now realizing this may have to be a two-parter because we're reaching that hour mark. But anything that we did not already mention in this first episode, you will be quite sure that we will mention in our second episode. So you can expect our second episode on this special series that we didn't expect to be a series. I thought it would just be one episode on why the nukes on Japan in 1945 were justified, and believe it or not, they did save lives. So, Chad, if you could get ready to end this. Um, um, we will come back to you in 3 days. We might just um, keep on going tonight and record this next episode as soon as we get into this one tonight. But you guys can expect the next episode of this unexpected series in 3 days' time. All right.
Yep.
So I'm Khalil,
I'm Chad. Thank you
and
all
we
for
are the
watching.
Marshals of Truth.
You know the drill. Like, subscribe. Have a great day.
And bless the YouTube algorithm. All right. Like, subscribe, comment, share to anyone you think might be interested, even people that you don't think would be interested. Share it to them too, you know, just to really bless that YouTube algorithm. We didn't really expect that this would be a channel that we would want to like get as many subscribers as possible. We thought it would just be an outlet for our own intellectual curiosity, but we have seen quite an interesting amount of support amongst those that we know, and spreading it to others beyond would be greatly appreciated. All right. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.